Hey everyone, welcome to WitCode, where in this video we're going to talk about the React useEffect cleanup function. So the useEffect cleanup function is an optional function returned from the useEffect hook that allows us to clean up operations after a component has unmounted. For example, we can use the useEffect cleanup function to stop ongoing API calls from setting state on an unmounted component. Setting state on an unmounted component can cause memory leaks, meaning memory that is no longer needed is not released. This can result in performance issues or even program failure. So as a demonstration of a memory leak, here we have a useEffect hook that makes a call on the initial render, as seen by these empty brackets, to this JSON placeholder typicode.com-posts, which retrieves a JSON array of posts, which we can see over here. On retrieving these, we then set some state for a posts array within here. And then we simply loop through these posts and post out the post title, body, ID, which is all this stuff here. And this code here works fine, but if the component has unmounted before this API call has finished, then this can cause some issues. Specifically, React will try to set the component state right here, even though the component has unmounted. And if it does this, this causes a memory leak. So a way around this is to use the useEffect cleanup function. And to use the useEffect cleanup function, we simply return a function from within useEffect. So in this useEffect hook here, all we need to do is just return a function, which here we're returning an anonymous arrow function. And now, in this case, let's prevent React from setting the state of the component if it has unmounted. And we can do that with a simple Boolean check. So we can create a variable here. Let's call it mounted and set that to false. And then here we can say, initially the component is mounted, so we set that to true. And then within here we say if mounted, only if the component is mounted do we want to set the state. And within our cleanup function, so when the component unmounts, that's when we set mounted equal to false. So here, when this component is unmounted, the cleanup function is called, which sets mounted to false. Therefore, the component state will not be set after the component has unmounted, because once mounted is set to false, this Boolean check fails, and we won't be setting any state. Now let's talk about the useEffect cleanup function and dependencies. So the useEffect cleanup function runs when a component unmounts if an empty dependency array is provided to it. However, the cleanup function will run to clean up the previous render if a non-empty dependency array is provided to it. This is useful because if useEffect makes an API call that depends on an item in its dependency array, we want to cancel the previous request when this item changes. As a demonstration, let's alter this program so that useEffect depends on the state of an ID property. So let's change this now in here to use an ID property right here. And now, instead of using posts, we're using a group of users. We have a function to get a random ID. And when we get that random ID, that's an ID for a user that we want to fetch the information for. And you can see now that this useEffect function will run every single time this ID changes. And this ID changes whenever this getRandomID method runs, which is whenever this button getRandomUser is clicked. So if we see, we can run this, and each time we get a new user. So essentially, whenever we click this getRandomUser button, our useEffect hook will be ran. And because we are depending on this ID here, each time this button is clicked and it causes useEffect to be run, it causes this cleanup function to be ran, which logs cleanup, which we can see it logged here. So we click getRandomUser, cleanup, and each time the ID changes, we can see how this cleanup function is ran. But so to make this more practical, let's use the useEffect cleanup function to abort the previous render's fetch request if it hasn't finished. In other words, if a new ID is generated before the previous fetch request finishes, let's cancel the fetch request that is still in progress. And we can do this with the abort controller interface. So if I paste this in here, this right here called abort controller. So the abort controller interface allows us to abort one or more web requests at any time. To do this, we associate the abort controller with an API request by passing it as an option to the fetch API. So here we have a controller, a new abort controller. We use destructuring to get the signal property, and we pass that as an option to the fetch API. In the cleanup function, so down here, we then call the abort method to cancel the fetch request before it has completed. So now, if the ID changes before the request is complete, the request will be aborted. And this saves us from more memory leaks. So let me just open up our console and now click getRandomUser. And what will essentially happen is we click this, we can see we get an error saying uncaught runtime errors, user aborted a request. So we can see how if we click this so fast that it causes a render, so say we click this really fast, we can get this runtime error. And of course, we can then handle this in here and just say console.error and log this error. So now let's try this again, but instead of throwing a nasty error, we'll just log it to the console, and you can see that listed out in here. So as opposed to getting that error, we just get DOM exception, the user aborted a request. But this is how we can use the useEffect cleanup function to cancel an uncompleted request with the fetch API. But so this is my video on the useEffect cleanup function. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments and I'll try and get back to you. But besides that, I want to thank you for liking and subscribing today, and I hope to see you in the next one. Have a good one.